There are so many people out there, mothers who have lost their children, people who have lost their loved ones, who refuse to give up and don't feel like they're getting the support that they deserve. But that sort of relentlessness that comes with loving somebody is a powerful thing that also comes out of these stories.
Welcome to Flip Your Script, the podcast about life's critical turning points and how people find the inspiration and motivation to move forward and rewrite their unique stories. Flip Your Script is produced by Media Minefield, a public relations firm passionate about the power of sharing stories. Specializing in earned and social media, Media Minefield helps clients take control of their unique story and message. The show is hosted by Kristi Piehl, founder and CEO of Media Minefield, who flipped her script from an Emmy-winning journalist to a successful entrepreneur and speaker.
If you're a podcast fan, and since you're here, I'm guessing you are, it's likely you know today's guest. Amanda Jacobson is basically podcast famous. Amanda and her two best friends flipped their scripts and turned a hobby into the wildly popular Wine and Crime podcast. It has a huge following and has received a lot of attention, including features in Rolling Stone and the Wall Street Journal. Amanda, welcome to my podcast.
Hi, I'm so happy to be here. This is amazing.
Well, you probably do so many podcasts, but may not get to be the person getting asked the questions as often as asking other people questions and talking to your friends about crime.
Yeah, it's really fun to have opportunities like this one because I know that so many people, I'd say especially millennials, and especially since the pandemic, have been curious about kind of the nitty-gritty of podcasting and how we fell into this job. And so I love these opportunities to share a little bit of the less glamorous behind the scenes stuff. But I'm also excited to get to know you. Your show is phenomenal. And I love the guests and the topics that you range. I think it's really cool what you're doing.
Thank you. And yeah. I have been listening to your stuff. We have very different styles.
Oh,
and it's great that you'd be fans of both kinds of shows, but they're very different, which is lovely. And that's what's awesome about podcasting is you can go out and find exactly what you need on that day.
Yeah, you really can. And sometimes for me, it's like not listening to anything true crime related to get a little break from the genre because we're in it all the time.
And the thing about true crime all the time, and I should back up, we're like way down the path. So if you don't know what the Wine and Crime podcast is, it is what it sounds, except with a twist. So they talk about true crime, Amanda and her two friends, and they also drink and talk about whatever they're drinking. And there's generally a theme. So the most recent one's cheese. I listened to one about punk. There's these different kind of themes that go through the whole thing. They also sport a very heavy and lovely Minnesota accent.
Oh, yeah.
There it is. There it is. And you said, something a little more casual. I do have wine in a very unclassy plastic. This is what was around the office today. So It's not very classy, but I did feel like since you're here, I should have wine.
That's hardcore. I am drinking coffee.
I didn't say I was going to drink it. I just said I have it here.
Okay. Fair enough. I mean, not to say that I have not had to record early in the day many times and just said, you know what, the rest of the day is going to be a wash. I'm drinking today. But, I support it. I love it. I love a good red wine in a plastic cup that you found at the office. That's a perfect pairing.
It's a good, perfect pairing.
Yeah.
So I'm really interested in how you and your besties who like drinking, like talking crime, you made this a legit job, not I'm living in my parents' basement, struggling with the podcast job, like a legit job. How did you even have the courage to say, you know what, we should do something with this? And just for people that aren't aware, the podcast started 5 years ago.
Yes, it did. And when we started it, I was still working in restaurant and hospitality management. One of the other hosts, Lucy, was working copy editing for a magazine, and Kenyon was actually living in South Africa there because her husband was teaching at a school in South Africa, and she could not get a visa that would allow her to work. And so she kind of found herself with a lot of time and was listening to a lot of podcasts and thought, wait a minute, I think this is something that we could do. From the beginning, she really had the long-term kind of manifestation of we could do this. This could be a business. I'm going to dive in and do a ton of research and figure out how people monetize their shows. And so when we decided, yes, let's give this a try, Lucy and I were a little more like, okay, well, we have full-time jobs. We can give this like 5 hours a week to do recording. I took on the editing, and I should have known right at the beginning that that is not a 5 hours a week project, but whatever. And we just kind of got into a groove, and we were like, we'll try one season and just see if people like it. And we have really only taken Christmas holiday off from releasing an episode every year for 5 years now. So obviously one season did not happen. And Kenyon really immersed herself in podcast monetization, and she took on sort of the advertising sales side of the project. We snatched up our social media handles. We built a pretty basic website. We got our RSS feed hosted just over on like SoundCloud, and we just started putting out content and doing a bunch of market research to see what other shows are doing things that are similar to what we're doing. Let's not only follow them, but let's collaborate with them. Let's, be in community with other podcasts. And we still continue to do that now. And we learned a lot from each other. And then we just kind of, a lot of it was luck. A lot of it was great timing. But as we started hitting benchmarks, we just would reach bigger. We'd reach out to bigger advertisers. We'd ask for more. And here we are. We have multiple employees. We have health insurance. We're a company. Like this is a company that sustains not only the three of us and our livelihoods and our retirement, but also we have hired and will continue to hire people as we grow. And we have more projects kind of on the fire that I can't quite announce yet, but I will let you know as soon as I can.
That's exciting.
It's
Congratulations.
Wild. Thank you.
Whenever anyone can figure out what they're passionate about, what they're good at, and figure out a way to make that their livelihood, it doesn't feel like work.
It doesn't. And sometimes you don't know what those things are until you just try it. Lucy and I were both apprehensive about leaving our jobs. For Lucy, it sort of happened without her having much say in it because there were massive layoffs at her business long before COVID. And so she got wrapped up in that, and the timing of it was really just the right time. And then for me, the more we worked on the podcast, the more I realized I love restaurants. I love working in hospitality, but this is not my career. This is not what I want to be doing when I'm 50, when I'm 60, when I'm 70. So that was kind of the possibility of the future was enough for me to go, well, I'm going to try it. Worst case scenario, I have so much restaurant experience. I can always come back. It's not the end of the world if this doesn't work out. So I think it was just, feeling the fear and doing it anyway.
That's great. Feel the fear, do it anyway. You also figured out a really unique niche because there's a lot of true crime podcasts, a lot. It's a very crowded space. You got in early. You already said that the timing was great. You said luck. I think it's more finding your own path. I don't know that. There's always a bit of luck, but women say luck. Men
we
say
do.
No. There was no luck. I'm amazing.
You're right.
Sorry, men. That's based on studies and research, not just man bashing, because we don't do that. You do it on your podcast.
We do a little bit.
On Mod. Yep.
We do it a little bit. I'll hold off.
Yeah, a little bit. So what I'm interested in is how you got, if you go back and listen to episode 1, 2, and 3 now, what did you do? Because I'm sure it's like, oh my gosh,
it's unlistenable. Yeah, I really struggle with that. I really do.
What did you do right then, even though it wasn't polished like it is now? You didn't have this team around you. What did you get right?
Mm-hmm. A couple things that were really intentional and then things that were really not intentional. So before we launched, we knew, just because of, like we said, market research, and especially Kenyon, our co-host, who is super into podcasts, that structure is very important, and a little bit of predictability for your listeners. Even if they're not able to predict everything that you're going to talk about, or, what casual conversations or candid conversations are going to happen on that show, a little bit of a timeline is really important for developing a show and then later monetizing that show. So we built a loose structure. In the beginning, we were like, let's rotate out who does the opening background in psychology and then who covers cases. And so we tried that one time, and Lucy was like, nope, I don't like covering cases. I want to focus on the background in psych. This feels like my niche. And we were like, great, because we don't like covering the background. It's like, we want to cover cases. So that fell into place really organically. And then we knew from the beginning that we wanted our friendship to be the authentic focus of the show. We knew that we wanted to talk about true crime like friends would talk about true crime. And so we've been friends since we were kids. So that was a really easy thing for us to commit to. And that has been the case since episode 1 and has lasted through now episode 241. So that was a big foundational part of the show, is we want it to be us. We want it to be a candid version of us, an authentic version of us. And we have not wavered from that since we started.
Were you worried that doing the podcast could ruin the friendship?
Oh, yeah.
But you did it anyway.
We did it anyway. I mean, any time you go into business with friends or family, it's a risk. And so from the beginning, we made a partnership contract that was an internal document just for us. It's not like a legal document, where we sat down and we went, okay, what are our expectations of each other? And how are we going to share responsibilities? How are we going to navigate this? And we revisit that contract every year or so. And at this point, the three of us are very much like sisters. So we disagree, we fight, and we have tough days, and our communication styles are not the same. But at the end of the day, it's always like, okay, I love you. We're going to figure this out and move forward. And we have invested a lot of time in learning about each other, learning how to approach each other, learning how to separate business from personal stuff. It's not always easy to do, but anything worth getting is never easy to do. So it's always been valuable and worth it to us to work through whatever human resource issues are gonna pop up, because they're gonna happen in every business. You just have that added fun complication of is this person so mad at me that they're not gonna come to my birthday party now? But it's never happened. So knock on wood.
And that's another impressive thing with what you've done, is that the authentic relationships comes across on the podcast. And I'm guessing that there are days where you've had to record and you haven't necessarily wanted to be on because you might have something going on in the background with that person. And the reality of doing what you do is you have to set that aside. When the mic is on and you're recording, you got to be friends.
Oh yeah. We've had those moments. We've had those moments both, the fortunate thing is, if we're having a really bad day and we don't think we can put out the best possible product, we can delay, we record ahead of time. So if a day is really bad for whatever reason, we're very good with each other to go, you know what, I can't be all in it today. Can we do this tomorrow? And 9 times out of 10, the answer is yes. Where sometimes you really have to work through some stuff is when you're on the road together, because we've toured multiple times. So sometimes that can get really long and really exhausting. We've learned that we love spending time together, but we do need to recharge in our own spaces. So now we get separate rooms, separate hotel rooms, just the things you learn about each other that I think sometimes you might feel, oh my gosh, how do I tell my best friends that I don't want to share a room with them on the road? Like, that's going to come off really mean. And at the end of the day, they're like, no, we don't want to do that either. Like, we got to do what we need to do to be energized and recharge and ready for the next day. So let's meet our needs, and let's meet each other's needs and figure out how to make this work. And we all have the same common goal, regardless of what's going on in our lives, regardless of what arguments we might be having or disagreements we might be having. We all have the same common goal. We want to keep doing the show. We love doing the show, and we want it to be successful. So that also helps be like a guiding light to get through certain things that can be challenging. And like I said, we've gone through a lot. We've gone through a lot in 25 plus years of friendship, and we've always figured it out and come out on the other side stronger, and I think more trusting of each other, because now we know how to have those conversations without causing harm. And I think that's a huge lesson.
And when you think about true crime and it's such a big business. So many people are interested in the topic, and yet it's so dark. I mean, it's a little jarring initially because on your podcast, it's horrible thing happened, joke. Does that mess with your mind when you're doing it?
It can be a really hard balance, because it feels like that doesn't make any sense. And that feels like that could be a structure that's really disrespectful and really tricky. So how we like to approach it is we stay very victim focused on our show. If we're making a joke, it's going to be about one of two things: a perpetrator who did something stupid or outlandish, or something that is happening in that conversation that we're having, you know, hearing that story or whatever, that we relate to something outlandish in our own life. So a lot of the humor is like, oh my gosh, remember that stupid thing we did XYZ years ago? Or, oh my gosh, I can't believe this absolute idiot is breaking into this house and like wearing duct tape as a mask. You know, it's staying very true to our own values, which are not to victim blame. And we feel like a preventative and holistic approach to criminal justice and restorative justice is the way to go. And it's just that comes through in the show. And if you stay authentic to your values, and one of those values is kind of laughing in the face of the boogeyman, it starts to fall into place in a way that people might not expect. And so we're not out here making light of horrible atrocities that have happened to real people. I mean, these are real people and their real stories. And we try to do those stories justice and lighten the mood when appropriate in a way that is not going to be in any way harmful, damaging, or deprecating to the victims and those victims' families.
The reason that you being a guest on this podcast works so well is you all flipped your script from idea to we're going to leave our jobs to do this. And also the concept of your podcast is a little script flippy, which I've never said before. But it's this dichotomy of light and really difficult. And the strange thing, I think, is just human nature, that's an escape. Hearing about these horrible, just awful things. Oftentimes it happened a long time ago or 20 years ago. I mean, criminals that many of us have heard of is an escape. And in the middle of a pandemic and at the end of like a really difficult day, people want to escape to difficult things. Were you worried that when the pandemic started that like maybe this would be too hard for people? Or have you been surprised at the escape that you're offering them, even though your subject matter is dark?
Definitely the latter. I mean, from day one, we have been shocked that we're really part of people's self-care. And that was not something that we really expected doing this show. And we've been interviewed many times about this in particular, and we have been part of like studies about this in particular, about why, especially folks who identify as women between the ages of about 20 and 35 are like the most all in on true crime. And what a lot of it comes down to is almost like an immersion therapy, or if you can gain some kind of understanding of a world and people who want to harm you, that it almost gives us this weird sense of security where it's like, okay, well, I know everything about this now, and so I can avoid this happening to me. And I think we know logically that that's not the case, that a lot of times we have very little control over the violence that we are victims of or can be victims of. But there's something comforting that we found for people to just kind of dive in and, like I said earlier, like laugh in the face of the boogeyman. I mean, if there's something that you're really scared of, something very real and dark in the world that you're really scared of, and you can listen to people talk about it in a way that you would want to talk about it, or that your friends would talk about it, and then end with laughter over a glass of wine, that thing starts to feel a little less scary. And so I think we saw a lot of that during the pandemic, where their routines were really upended. All of our routines were. And so in the beginning, I think we saw like a little fear from especially advertisers, and then a little drop in our listenership because people weren't commuting anymore, and people were readjusting to, raising and their families and doing jobs and teaching their kids remotely. I mean, we had to be so many different things during this pandemic. And then we just kind of kept at it. It was a lifeline for us to be just rooted in our routine. We're not changing what we're doing. This is our job. We're going to keep doing it. And then the listeners, they always come back, and people establish their routines, and it got kind of reintegrated into becoming part of people's self-care. And a lot of the feedback that we have gotten, especially over the last now 2 years, is that, you know, you kept me sane during the pandemic, or when all of us were so isolated, I could turn on your show and I felt like I was hanging out with my friends. And that was huge for us to know that we could bring that tiny bit of comfort to people through this weird and silly project. But there's so much more that people are getting out of it than just, I want to hear about crime, that we never anticipated.
And that's a really great transition into what I want to ask you about next. So voila, you've done this before. So the Wall Street Journal wrote about your show, and this was in 2018. So this is pre-George Floyd, pre all the things that have happened in the world since. So just get 2018 in your head. Listeners, not you. You were there for this. So.
Yeah.
Okay, this is what they said about the show, which I think is the depth that you're giving that people may or may not even realize you're giving them, which I suspect is one of the reasons it's as popular as it is, and not just jumping onto the bandwagon of true crime. But this is what the Wall Street Journal said. They are true crime fans who use the show as a platform to bring attention to social issues and injustices, especially racial discrimination by police and the all too frequent mishandling of evidence and botching of cases. Did you referenced it a little bit at the beginning when we started, but did you know that you were going to go to this depth at the beginning, or did that sort of come out of your perception as you read more about crime?
I really didn't know. I mean, the three of us have always been very left-leaning, progressive individuals. However, we were not on the same level of our anti-racism journeys in 2018. And like many, 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 many white people, especially white women, the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, which is the city where I live. So we've really been the epicenter of a lot of social and racial reckoning in the United States over the last, year and a half. But we weren't on that journey in the beginning. And we very much got on it when things started to go down in our city. And while Kenyon and Lucy don't live here anymore, they're still from this area. And obviously they care a lot about these issues. And so that shift, I can hear it going back and listening to previous episodes of the show. And it's something that actually makes it challenging for me, because I do love listening to and watching true crime. But one thing that I think does happen, and we're learning and starting to see and kind of admit more, is a number of things. One, we tend to kind of glorify investigators that maybe should be looked at with a more scrutinous eye and held more to account. And so a lot of folks will speak out and say, hey, true crime is kind of becoming like police propaganda. And you start to peel back those layers and go, okay, yeah, I could see that. I could see how this is the effect and the harm that these shows could be doing. Also, we're three white women hosting this show. And so I think a lot of times what can happen, and we've seen it happening very recently with the Gabby Petito case, is that we can get into a comfortable space of only talking about stories where the victims look like us. And that was something intentional from the beginning that we didn't want to do. We didn't want to do a couple of things. One, we didn't want it to be all about young white women for a multitude of reasons. One, obviously the racism in that. And two, we also don't want to spend every waking minute of our jobs talking about people being murdered who we could project our own faces and lives directly on. So there is an element of that self-care that goes into, let's not focus all the time on only this. But the most important part of that is that we felt like true crime was a saturated market and covering the same stories over and over and over again. If you want to know what's going on in the Gabby Petito case, that case is brand spanking new, and there's already like 5 podcasts about it. And TV specials. And, you know, we've all heard the stories about Ted Bundy, and yeah, we covered Ted Bundy, you know, but we didn't want to do that. We wanted to come into the genre that's already so saturated and tell stories that people had not heard before. And that means telling stories that aren't getting covered in the media. And sometimes that makes our jobs a lot harder because we're doing internet research to cover these cases. And so sometimes that means we have to dig a lot deeper, and that we have to focus on that case by saying, hey, there's not a lot about this in the media right now. Here's what we could find. Here's what, you know, here's the impact that this case is having. And here are ways that, you know, you can find out more or maybe help with this investigation. We don't cover a whole lot of stuff that's unsolved. Some of that is my ADHD. I like everything wrapped up in a neat little package. But we're also not journalists, and we're not investigators. And so we have a murky ethical line where we do not adhere to the same codes as a journalist. And so we cite all of our sources. One of the things we say a lot is we're speculating wildly. We say on the show constantly, we are not journalists. This is just our opinion. This is what we think is going on. And then we try to share resources if something is unsolved, to say, hey, if you know anything, here are the places where you can report something. But yeah, we try to really find and tell those stories that are not being told ad nauseum. And the unfortunate reality is that many of those stories are about Black and trans women, Indigenous women, and people of color that are not getting headline news in the way that young people who look like us are getting headline news. So that was just kind of a natural trajectory of the show. And as we have learned by learning from and following Black anti-racism educators, we're getting better every day at having a critical eye, seeing things through a lens that's not just a lens of whiteness. And frankly, the criminal justice system is one that we have not experienced in the same way as our Black and brown neighbors. And so taking on, you know, that shift was natural as we are evolving as people behind these microphones, because what you're getting on our show is us. It's us authentically, it's us naturally, and you're getting us at whatever spot on our journey through whatever we're going through is on. So, you know, listen at your own risk, but that's kind of how that evolution worked.
Well, that's the relatability, right? Mm-hmm. That's the reason that people can sit down and say, I feel like I'm sitting with my friends, because everyone, if we're being honest, is processing. Nobody has this figured out. We've never done this before. And there's a lot of surprise. I mean, if you were to say to most white people, name some crime victims, they're naming white people, mm-hmm. right? They're naming Jody Huisentruit. They're unsolved. You go Jacob Wetterling. I mean, again, these are Minnesota Midwestern cases. And even Gabby, how many women are attacked and go missing and are found dead that we never hear about? Mm-hmm. And that, like, from the journalist in me is like, well, yeah, that case got pub because they had the body camera and it made good TV. And then to say like a crime is making good TV is weird, but it raised the domestic violence awareness in the country. So that's good. So like, it's the both and, but I appreciate that you're bringing up these cases that many people haven't heard of, because I'm sure that for you, like when I listen to your stuff, you go, I can't believe I didn't know this.
Yeah.
How did I not know this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that happens all the time. I mean, we're learning right along with our listeners. And that's another reason why we want to cover cases that we haven't heard, is because that's also more interesting for us. We want to learn new things and we want to expand, you know, our own depth of knowledge. And so we're constantly trying to go down avenues that we haven't gone down before and try something new.
If you could sit with any murderer who could be the fourth member on a podcast, living or dead, who would it be?
Oh my gosh. Ooh, that's hard. I mean, I don't know if I even want to do that, but I'm going to honor this question because...
Let's pretend you're safe and there's a nice cage that person is in.
You know, I never want to bring them on the podcast because none of these people need any more attention than they've already gotten. But I want to sit with either the Zodiac, which I know is like hot off the press right now, that we may finally have an answer to that. Or, and this is totally a cheat because it's also a cold case that like everybody wants the answer to, I would want to sit with whoever killed JonBenet Ramsey.
Ooh, that's a good one.
So then I get a twofer. It's like, okay, I know who it is now. And I get to ask you so many questions that America has been burning to know since like 1991 or whatever.
Think of the ratings. Boom.
That case is still such like a hot sale item. I know it's like so gross to think about that, but I mean, just think about the few times since JonBenet was killed that we've had like a lead, and then even now in 2021, that would if we got new information about the JonBenet Ramsey case, even if it wasn't solved tomorrow, it would be plastered all over every magazine in the checkout line at the grocery store. You wouldn't be able to walk down the street without seeing or hearing something about it. I mean, that's like one of the most sensational cases in American history. It's nuts.
Do you think you know who did it?
Oh, I really think I know who did it. But I think that person has sued other people for saying it. So I'm not going to put you in that position.
I appreciate that.
But that should answer your question.
Yes, it does. So if that person is listening and doesn't want to sue anyone, they have an open invitation to be on the Wine and Crime podcast.
They really do. Come on down.
I once, because I was a journalist, interviewed. Have you ever been like face to face with an actual murderer?
I have not. And that's, I mean, because our show is comedy too, that's just like not something we would really ever do. We've been emailed from prison.
Jail, for sure.
Yeah. But we're usually like, no, thank you. Wish you all the best. That's not what we do.
Pub. Yeah, you don't need any more pub. Nope. I interviewed once. He's now a convicted murderer and has gotten some publicity. And I don't even like to say his name, so I'm not going to. But he was a police officer in Ohio who hired some people to kill his wife. And so he didn't actually do the killing, but he hired some people.
Right.
But I did an interview with him. I have to tell you, Amanda, he had, this was before, like he was just accused.
Mm-hmm.
Like the blankest, coldest, freakiest eyes.
Yep.
Like,
we call those dead fish eyes on our show.
Yes.
Yeah.
It was so strange to be in the presence. Like you walk in the room and feel like cold and dark.
I mean, that's real.
Weird. It's real.
That's a real psychological and physical thing. And that is one of those moments that really reminds you like, oh yeah, humans are animals. We're animals. And so we are going to respond to each other instinctually in ways that we suppress all the time because we're not typically in those situations. But you were in a situation where it was like, oh, I'm on the food chain.
Yeah.
Like I'm having like a reaction just thinking about that. But if we're able to react in that way with, respond to energies, then there's obviously an energy that gets put out into the world by certain people. And there's like a psychological link to that kind of like lights off, kind of just distant, dead,
soulless.
Eyes. Yeah, soulless eyes.
And even to this day, it's been years, I can the hair on my arm stands up. Mm-hmm. It's very freakish. And this is what juries too bad can't do. Like we don't need a trial. Let's spend 5 minutes with the killer. Yeah, you're guilty.
I know. I mean, the justice system would be pretty wild if that's how we did it. But I do think that there are times when you can just tell something's not right. And our instincts are there for a reason. And, I don't know. Sometimes you got to listen to the little hairs that are standing up on the back of your neck.
What about OJ? Would you like to sit in a room with OJ?
I don't know. That case was not one that was like super gripping for me growing up. There were so many, this was like such a thing in the 90s, I feel like, where, I mean, maybe it's because we grew up in a time of like JonBenet, OJ, and then obviously like the Clinton impeachment. And there were just so many sensational courtroom dramas that were really playing out in real time on our televisions, like every night at 6 p.m. And I grew up in that exact sensational whirlwind in a very formative time in my life. Like I do remember watching the police chase of the white Bronco. Like I do.
Me too. I know right where I was. It's weird.
Mm-hmm. But, you know, there are some, I don't have a strong desire, frankly, to like ever be in a room or speak with or learn from any of the people that did or allegedly did these things. I would rather, like, if I had it my way, I would, if it was like, if you could have dinner with anyone living or dead, I'm going to pick the victims every time, because I want their perspective. I want to know what happened through their eyes, because that's the only thing that matters and the only thing that we cannot get. And so that makes your job so hard, because you're like, we're out here telling these stories for people who can't tell them themselves. So you got to be really careful with how you do that. And
if you could have dinner with them the day before, just be like, tomorrow,
I know,
don't go to the restaurant.
I know, it's 2021. Why do we not have our time machine?
Right.
This is ridiculous.
Stay at a friend's house. You really don't want to go home. Trust me.
Yeah.
Go on the date, get a hotel room. Like, don't go home. Mm-hmm. Nothing good is happening when you go home. Mm-mm. What episode do you get the most listens, most comments? Like, it's weird to say, like, what's your favorite crime? But like, is your favorite episode what your fans have liked the most or not?
I mean, it really varies. I'm going to be honest. Like, we do have very predictable, like, stable listenership across the entire show. And obviously when we're still capturing new audiences, so episodes at the beginning are going to have much higher listenership than the most recent episode that just came out. But it's so funny because we have Patreon, which is a website that allows listeners to support us financially. And that's the only reason we've ever been able to like upgrade any of our equipment. I mean, we wouldn't be a business now if it weren't for our patrons. They're amazing. But at a certain tier, they can pick a topic that we're going to cover. They can pick a specific crime. They can pick a wine. They really get to kind of run the show. And the fans pick the darkest stuff. Like, they are always the ones that are picking the most gruesome, bizarre, like really scary stories. And so we'll have weeks, months of fan pick episodes, and then we'll go, okay, we're picking an episode, we're cheese crimes. Like, we need to get a break from what you guys are making us cover. But so the listeners, we sometimes will do these episodes called Beyond Stupid, where it's basically just like a very lighthearted, silly episode about just weird crime, current events, like just the silliest possible crimes where people aren't necessarily dying or anything really bad is happening to them.
And it starts with a Florida man.
Usually, yes. A lot of stories out of Florida. But people love those episodes, but people love the really dark ones. I mean, I think at the end of the day, they are going to respond however we're responding in the moment. So like, we do like covering some of those twisted, interesting, layered cases, because it's a strange and creepy narrative. And I think since the beginning of man, we've been telling campfire stories, and we've had our way, some way, shape, or form, to consume true crime as an entertainment. I mean, when you think about it, like, gallows humor is called gallows humor for a reason. I mean, people used to gather in the square and like watch trials and executions. And that's not something that we want to do now. But I do feel like the true crime genre is an evolution of this human desire to be adjacent to morbid things and maybe like taboo things and read into them. And it's kind of like titillating in a weird way. And so we like that too. I mean, it would be a lie if we said that we didn't, but sometimes it does get to be a little bit much. And then we have to plan episodes that are going to be a little better for our mental health, or we'll take a recording break and we'll record it ahead of time.
And so play with some puppies, look at some rainbows. Like, how do you guys keep from believing that everyone you encounter is going to kill you or rob you, or because at some point you spend a lot of time in this area, so you must need to still believe that people are mostly really good.
I think true crime as a genre can have kind of a weird, like you would say, script flip in that way, because for every story where someone is doing something awful, there's usually like 3-5 times the people that are doing something good to try and help that person who's the victim of something awful, whether they've survived or not. And so in these stories, while, yeah, we're focusing a lot on some of the deep, dark stuff, there are other stars in that story. There are other people. Mr. Rogers would always say, look for the helpers. Like, there are helpers in every scenario. And a lot of times those are the ones that are closest to and love those victims the most, that are out there advocating, out there making serious legislative, legal change as a legacy for their loved one. And of course, we'd rather have their loved one here, but, you know, turning some of that pain into something good, those are also important things to take from these stories, and to take the survivors' legacy that they carry on maybe after their loved one has passed on. That's also powerful. I find that equally powerful, to get those stories out of these kind of dark and scary stories too.
And to your point about the helpers, how many of these cases are solved because someone had the courage to step up and say, hey, that doesn't feel right. That didn't look right. I think I saw this. And then how many other cases where someone was able to do something in a serial kind of fashion where people didn't step up. And that's not like, it's not their fault that the guy kept killing. But we all have to be brave, see something, say something.
Yeah, bravery and I think relentlessness. You know, I mean, there are so many people out there, mothers who have lost their children, people who have lost their loved ones, who refuse to give up and don't feel like they're getting the support that they deserve. And if I'm certain that they're not. But that sort of relentlessness that comes with loving somebody is a powerful thing that also comes out of these stories. It's tragic, but it's also powerful. And so those are important parts of these stories to acknowledge, that it's not all pain and suffering and darkness. There's also a lot of progress and community and love and powerful action that comes from these stories.
There's always light.
In
the midst of all that darkness, there's always light. So your advice, before I get to the last question, your advice for people that are thinking, okay, whether it's a podcast or I'm in my, stable job, but I really have this passion over here. It sounds like, and I want to make sure I didn't miss anything. Be intentional, do some research, figure out how you're really going to monetize it. Don't leave your day job too early. Let someone else pay for your health insurance for a while, which I say all the time, and then take the leap. Yeah.
I mean, as I said earlier, that was to feel the fear and do it anyway. This is a series that a woman in Minneapolis who works, I think, for CBS, her name is Sheila Reeves. She has been doing this like Friday night series where she interviews all these different people who are in different places in their lives and taking on different, specifically entrepreneurial journeys. And that was one of the kind of the talk episodes that she hosted that I got to be on. And I was like, wow, that is really the foundation of what this is, like feeling the fear and doing it anyway. And I also recognize all of the privilege that comes along with me being able to do that. I mean, I'm a type 1 diabetic and I had healthcare and everything covered through my previous restaurant job. And I left because I knew that I could get on state insurance. So like, there are certain things that I know that I have access to that not everybody has access to. So doing that research, making a plan, that's a really important part of it too. I'm not going to sit here and tell you like, quit your job and everything's going to work out fine. You need to be really committed. You need to be keeping your expectations reasonable. I do a lot of podcasting consultation, and usually one of the first things I'll ask is like, what do you want to get out of this? Do you want to monetize? Do you want this to be your job? Or are you sharing a passion project? And is this for you to share something with the world, whether or not you ever see a financial return on this? And knowing that before you go into really any project that you take on is important. Because even when I left restaurants, I still kept like a foot in there. I was still waiting tables a couple times a week and just making sure that I had some kind of income. You have to be reasonable and pragmatic about the decisions that you're making. But if you don't take the risk, you're never going to get access to the rewards. And the rewards can be astronomical. And if you're actually passionate about it and you care about what you're doing, especially if it's a public facing thing, if it's specific to podcasting, people are going to know when you're faking it when they're listening to you. They're going to know if you don't actually care about the topic that you're covering. And if you're just trying to tap into a market that you feel like is financially viable, that's going to come through. People who listen to podcasts really want that level of authenticity. That's a big part of what podcast listeners are looking for. So like you said earlier, you can go online and find a podcast to talk about anything you want. And that's amazing. But the ones who are going to, the cream that's going to rise to the top are the ones that are really into what they're talking about and really care about it. And
comes across.
Yeah. And that comes across to your listeners.
Okay. One more quick question before I get to the last question, because I'm sure someone is really curious. What's your favorite wine?
Ooh, I think my favorite varietal is probably Grenache, which is a red, but then they also make beautiful Grenache rosés. And so I love it as a varietal because you can drink it like all year round, because you can get it as like a robust kind of spicy red, but then they'll also make it as a rosé as like a cold summer sipper. So it's a beautiful Spanish varietal. I highly, highly, highly recommend it. It's going to be a game changer. That's my favorite.
And brilliant for starting something where wine is involved, which now means that people send you free wine.
They do. We get a lot of wine. It's amazing. I mean, that was one of the things where we were like, okay, true crime is really fun, but how can we make this a little different? And it was super fun for me because working in restaurants and bars and at a management level, I did a ton of like the wine program and ordering for different restaurants that I worked at. And I got to work toward, and this sounds way fancier than it is, but it really just means like I know how to open a bottle of wine. But I got to work toward like my level 2 sommelier license.
Ooh, watch the doc, everyone.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, if you watch it and you're like, oh yeah, level 2 means she knows the difference between like a wine and a foot. Like once you get all the way to the top, it's like, this is like doctorate level knowledge that I'm never going to get, but that's fine. I don't need it. But it was a really fun way to incorporate that and use something else that I really love and am passionate about on the show. So it's been such a fun journey, I guess.
And if anyone is curious, the boxed wine that was sitting in the office in my plastic cup has not yet been sipped. But I have been smelling it the entire time.
I'm sure it's hard not to. It's really opening up in that room. It's really breathing.
It's been in a box for a while. So,
yeah.
Yes, it's really opening up. All right. You're horrified now.
You're so funny. I love it.
So as we wrap up, it's been such a pleasure to talk to you. I'm so impressed when people can take a passion, turn it into something, and then share their knowledge to help other people. That's what this podcast is all about. I'm going to keep listening to what you're doing. And I really hats off to you. Is there a quote or something that has motivated you as you flipped your script?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked me this because I was thinking about this after the email that I got from your team. There was a project that I did in college where our professor gave us the assignment to remove the word should from your vocabulary and treat it as like a dirty word, basically, like an expletive for a whole week and see how you feel at the end of it. And while it was really hard and it continues to be really hard, I have sat with that lesson ever since. Especially when it comes to going out on your own and trying something new. The word should, if you can change that mindset to what could I do? What could happen next? It's transformative. It opens all kinds of doors because I think we forget or just don't see how many like limiting thoughts that we have throughout any given day. And if we can make one small adjustment to how we're speaking to ourselves, doors are going to fly open. And if you're thinking about what could be and what you could be doing and not what you should be doing, it just kind of changes the whole context of everything that you have going on in your life. So that's like a big lesson that I got in college. And I tell everybody about this because it's like, it's so cool. But I am giving you an assignment to try it for 1 week and just see how it feels. And then I think you might get hooked on it because it's pretty amazing in terms of how affirming that practice is.
Just changes the mindset. That's fantastic. I recently on a podcast heard a riddle that I've shared with a bunch of people, similar fashion. And there were 3 frogs sitting on a log and one decided to jump off. How many are left?
Ooh, one decided to jump off. 3 frogs. So 2, logically.
That's logically, but the one just decided. The frog never jumped. So deciding, like, boom, right? Deciding to do something is not the same as doing it, which is that should thing. It's a big difference. You could have decided to do a podcast 5 years ago, and where would your life be?
Yeah.
But you did it.
Yeah. I love that.
Good stuff.
We're going to borrow each other's affirmations. I love that. That's so cool.
I will be listening for you to drop mine, and you can listen and I will drop yours.
Great. Perfect.
Love it. I'm going to wrap this one up with one thing that Amanda said a few times, which is feel the fear and do it anyway. But because we're talking about the topic of what her podcast is, I think it's safe to say, unless you're in a dark alley and there's someone coming after you, then call 911.
Use your best judgment. Yeah.
Call
use
911.
Discernment.
Take a video and upload it to someone who will call the police for you.
Mm-hmm. Share your location.
Please. My hope is Amanda's story empowers you to believe you're capable of more than you think, to discover motivation, to uncover inspiration, and to find the strength to turn the page.
Thank you for listening to Flip Your Script, hosted by Kristi Piehl and produced by Media Minefield. If you like our message, please be sure to give us a 5-star rating, subscribe to the show, and share our episodes with your family and friends. Do you or someone you know have a story about flipping your script? We'd love to share it. Contact us on our website, flipyourscriptpodcast.com. To stay up to date on all things Flip Your Script, make sure to follow host Kristi Piehl on social media. You can also check out the website for pictures, resources mentioned in the show, and other great episodes.